Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable Infrastructure webinar series that is entitled Putting Principles into Practice. This is our fourth webinar, and we will tackle the Principle 3. So I'm Anna Gros from the French research program ITECOP, and I'll present you the logistics of today's conference. We'll remind you that this session is being recorded and that your attendance is consent to be recorded. Don't hesitate to use the chat function on Zoom for question or technical assistance, because Claire and Sarah are here to help you. And note that a link to this session recording will be emailed to you and available on our website. This session is really particular because it is an hybrid session. Usually we do only on the web, but today we're on the IUCN Congress in Marseille. So the session will be included in part of the IUCN Congress. So on the chat, you will find some links towards the IUCN World Congress on Nature. And I would like also to introduce a big event that would be held tonight. That is the launch of Transport for Nature initiative. So on the chat, you will find also the link to the event and way to register and to attend the event. I'd like now to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Elisabeth Lessos. She's a tropical forest biologist and environmental policy analyst. She is currently senior fellow at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solution at Duke University, where she and her colleagues are working on sustainable infrastructure, environmental and social policy, adaptation and resilience, and international development. So finally, today we will use a separate tool called a Menti Meter. So I don't know if there is still an exercise to use Menti Meter. Yes, it is. So please click on the link in the chat to practice Menti Meter, because you will use it during the whole session. And the floor is yours, Elisabeth.
Thank you, Anna, and it's exciting to have some input from the IUCN meetings. And welcome, everyone. Welcome back after our month-long hiatus, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time to Sustainable Infrastructure, Putting Principles into Practice. Just a quick reminder, the objectives of the series are to share knowledge about sustainable infrastructure, to participate in a forum that brings practitioners together along with specialists, and also just to connect a global community of practice of those engaged in sustainable infrastructure. And on this last point, we have recently started a LinkedIn group where we're going to begin sharing information and resources. So if you haven't had a chance to join our LinkedIn group, please do so. The link is in the chat. And so today, next slide. And of course, these are the organizations that are hosting today's talk. And ICSE, I noticed I left them off the slide, our latest host organization. There we go. And next slide. So the last three sessions, we had an introduction and covered the first two principles. Today, we will do principle number 3, comprehensive life cycle assessment of sustainability. In today's talk, we're going to hear a little bit about the principle, and then we're going to have both a technical talk about some of the methods used to address this, as well as a case study analysis, a case study from Mongolia. And next slide. Excuse me, and speaking of case studies, we are also starting to have short write-ups of each of the case studies from our group. You can see each of these on, you can find them on our website. We'll also be putting them in our LinkedIn site. You can also go back and listen to the recordings. We will be building up a library of case studies. And the first one we have from Strategic Environmental Assessments in Pakistan, hydropower development, is now available. Next slide. So let's go back to the Menti Meter next slide, that Anna introduced. And in your chat, the Menti Meter link is available. We would like everyone to practice and give us a little information on 2 questions. What would you use to describe your profession? And the second question,
Can you see the screen, Liz?
I can. You know what? Why don't we just go ahead and do the 2 Menti Meters, and Emily, you can end up showing the results when we come back in.
Okay, sounds good.
But so the 2 questions are where you are and what you're doing. And at that, I'm actually going to introduce Emily Corwin, who is a water resource engineer, and she directs the nature-based engineering program at Conservation International, nature-based engineering solutions at Conservation International, and also the Green Gray program. So Emily, why don't you go ahead and take it from there?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Liz, and welcome everyone. Anna, I can see you there at IUCN. Welcome to our colleagues in Marseille and at the World Conservation Congress. It's great you were able to join us. So the Menti Meter survey and the link, hopefully you can see the screen. I've got the results kind of showing here about what 1 word would you use to describe your profession. And it looks like we have an amazing diversity of attendees today, because there's no 1 word that's kind of bigger than another, though I see kind of variations of the word engineer here and conservation, which is great. And we're so glad that we have so many different perspectives and professions represented. So the second question, just so we can know who's in the room and where we're coming from, is where are you in the world? So this is my favorite slide, because even though we have all spent so much time in our own homes over the last 1.5 years, this is just an incredible way to connect with colleagues all around the world. So it looks like we have a good representation from the US, even though it's very early here where I am in California. I'm wondering if anyone else is on the West Coast here with me. And then we have some great representation from Myanmar, which is great. Welcome. All right, with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Rowan Palmer. And Rowan is a program management officer at the UN Environment Program. He is based in the Resources and Markets Branch in Geneva, Switzerland, and leads UNEP's Sustainable Infrastructure Partnership. So with that, I'll pass it to Rowan to share his screen.
Thanks very much, Emily. I'm just doing my screen share. Bear with me for a second. Let's see. You should all be able to see a slide with 10 principles on it. If not, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll get started. So yeah, as Liz mentioned in her introduction, this webinar series is structured around the 10 international good practice principles for sustainable infrastructure. These are the 10 you can see on the screen. And for those interested in checking out the full document with the details.
All right, Rowan, we're seeing your presentation mode.
Oh, okay, hold on, let me try again. How's that?
Looks great.
Okay, Great, thanks. So yeah, the link to the full principles will be in the chat. For those who might be joining for the first time, just a quick recap. In the session for Principle 1, we learned about strategic planning and policy alignment, and specifically, we learned about strategic environmental assessments as a planning tool. In the second session, we covered needs-based approaches that can help ensure responsive, flexible, and resilient service provision. And today's webinar is about Principle 3, Comprehensive Lifecycle Assessment of Sustainability. And one thing to keep in mind is that these principles do build on each other, and things covered under one are relevant for others. So we're also going to hear about, for example, the use of strategic environmental assessments today, but in a slightly different context than we covered in the strategic planning session, but also talk about the role that these life cycle assessments have in strategic planning and some of the other principles. So Principle 3 states that infrastructure's environmental, social, and economic sustainability should be assessed as early as possible in planning cycles. It should cover financial as well as non-financial factors across different projects and different systems and different sectors over the entire life cycle of those infrastructure systems. Assessments should consider the cumulative impacts of infrastructure development on ecosystems and on communities as part of a broader landscape, so beyond a project's immediate vicinity, and this includes taking account of transnational impacts. When we talk about impacts across the infrastructure life cycle, this diagram shows you the infrastructure life cycle that we're talking about, that goes from strategic planning and project prioritization in the upstream phases all the way through to construction and operations and decommissioning in the more downstream phases. So in terms of life cycle assessment, planners and designers are going to need to use these types of assessments to account for impacts that are mainly going to occur during the downstream phases, during construction and operations and decommissioning. But these assessments need to occur more upstream in the process during the planning, strategic planning, project prioritization, and then into project planning and project design as well. So this principle really touches on the whole life cycle. And to unpack the key elements of the principle, there's really two main things that it's getting at. The first is about understanding not just financial and economic costs and benefits, but also social and environmental factors. And so these include, the relationship between infrastructure and nature, the impacts that they have on each other, also the value provided by nature, by biodiversity and ecosystem services, and then social factors like human rights, inclusiveness, job creation, gender impacts, health and safety of workers, communities, etc. And the second key point is that it's important to understand cumulative impacts of multiple infrastructure projects across their whole life cycle. So this really helps determine if the overall mix of infrastructure systems in a given area is really providing the best solutions for meeting service needs on the one hand, but also sustainability objectives on the other hand. And today we're going to see a case from Mongolia, and also see how life cycle assessment is done in the development corridor partnership in the other presentation. And so there are tools, as I mentioned, that can help understand these type of impacts and do these types of life cycle assessments. So things like SEA that I mentioned, and which is the strategic environmental assessment, and cumulative effects assessment that really need to be applied as early as possible to be able to inform the planning and the design. So I'll leave it there and pass the floor to our first presenter, Diego Hufe, who will present next. Over the last 10 years, Diego has worked in major global conservation organizations, including IUCN and the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center, helping NGOs, companies, financial institutions, and governments to make better decisions about how to manage biodiversity. Diego is currently a freelance biodiversity consultant and a PhD researcher at the Durrell Institute for Conservation and Ecology at the University of Kent in the UK, where his work focuses on impact assessments and biodiversity impact mitigation at the landscape level in Kenya and Tanzania as part of the Development Corridors Partnership Project. So, Diego, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rowan. Does everyone hear me well? I assume yes. I'm going to share my screen now. Do you see the presentation? Good. Okay, hello. So I'm going to talk to you specifically about all the aspects that Rowan talked about are really important, but specifically, I'm going to talk to you about biodiversity impact mitigation. I recently been for 3 days in the World Conservation Congress, and I think it's quite relevant because of that. It's still running, of course, as we know, we are joining there, but also that's my area of expertise. So my presentation, it's not acknowledging, or it doesn't talk about the socio-ecological context of any project, which is incredibly important, in addition to looking at biodiversity. And we conservationists know that we cannot do any conservation without stakeholder involvement and understanding the socio-ecological context. So having said that, I'm going to start my presentation about biodiversity impact mitigation. And I work at the Development Corridors Partnership, so my presentation is going to focus on that particular phenomenon of infrastructure development. Development Corridors Partnership, it's a funded project by the UK Research and Innovation Challenges Fund. It's going to finish very soon this year, at the end of the year. It's been running for 4 years. It's formed by 11 institutions from China, Kenya, Tanzania, and the UK, and it has over 40 researchers and 30 projects. Our project focuses on development corridors and only the development corridors in Kenya and Tanzania, but we're hoping that the lessons learned can be applied globally as well. So what is a development corridor? That would be the first thing that we might ask ourselves. So development corridor, you can see two pictures there. It's a large, often transnational and linear geographical area targeted for infrastructure investment. Normally, it's developed under a spatially oriented and common economic strategy, and it aims to achieve economic development. They are usually multi-project, multi-stakeholder projects as well. So multi-stakeholder, multi-project initiatives, and they are usually transnational as well. So I think it's quite relevant for this session. So on the right of the screen, on the map of Kenya, you can see two examples, the Lamu Port, South Sudan, Ethiopia Transport Corridor, and below in red line, the Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya, with two other projects that we're working on Development Corridors Partnership. So these are projects, for example, LabSed, it's in implementation right now, but there are highways, there are railways, there are ports, there are airports, there are resort cities. So there are projects at a massive scale that have several projects interacting in the same space. And probably the most well-known manifestation at a global scale of this idea is the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is led by the Chinese in cooperation with lots of countries, and it's composed by at least 9 corridors, and it covers half of the globe. And at the moment, as far as I'm aware, there are over 100 countries that are ascribed to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a kind of a group of development corridors, if I am allowed to describe it like that. How do these development corridors unfold in terms of impacts on biodiversity? So imagine this conceptual design where a development corridor is a square. We will have a project 1 that could be a road, and that project will have an direct impact, which is the footprint of the road. But because of that road being there will be people coming in, there will be development around the road, resource extraction, and that will create indirect impacts that are not directly created by the road, but because of the project. And then a second project could be a mine that the load is leading to, and that is another project. And it will have an impact C, which is the direct impact of a mine, but it will also have indirect impacts like maybe nutrients downstream of a river, polluting a river, or even it's not done properly, or new populations emerging because they work for the mine, and that creates new indirect impacts as well. And then we have cumulative impacts, which is the interaction between different projects in the same area that create new impacts. And then another type of cumulative impacts is those because of natural climate change or natural and social stressors that can also combine with other projects can create few impacts. And if if we illustrate, so in a way, all the whole suite of impacts can be summarized as the sum of these three types of impacts: direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts. And if we look, this is just a very simple and totally made up example. Imagine we have a city by the sea. There are a couple of villages, one in a protected area. There are 4 protected areas, which is the green sites that I draw there. And there's a river going through the valley, and then there's a little road that connects the city to the village, and the other village is it's kind of isolated or has a minor road. And if our development corridor has a mine, a factory, and a port, and it's all acts as a network for economic development, and you're building a railway and a better road to facilitate economic development, trade, and just the functioning of the system, this could be a very simple development corridor, a transport corridor, or a trade corridor. Then the first thing you would do is to identify the area of influence of that corridor, which you have to use ecological criteria to define that area of influence. It's not related to the impacts, it's related to, it could be a catchment or a few catchments. There's a lot to discuss about that. So the first impact that is in yellow or orange would be the impact on the river, probably downstream of the mine or downstream of the factory. Then another village might appear, and this village will have impacts around it. People will come in, will grow agriculture, families will grow, economy will grow, so there is impact on biodiversity there, and the protected area might be impacted. Same thing for the other village that might increase its population because of being a mine and more employment. Same thing happens with the infrastructure linear developments. We will have an influence, indirect impact, as you can see in the yellow polygons. And then the port might have other indirect impacts. Same for the other villages that will grow. So you can see the picture: economic development, and if it's not managed in a good way, it can create impacts. So I'm pointing here the indirect impacts and the cumulative impacts, which is the interaction of several impacts. So if you want the overlap. So how do we manage all of this? So there's one way is looking at the infrastructure cycle. And we have an instrument that we've talked about, which is the strategic environmental assessment. And this will be very appropriate because it looks at a strategic level, what's happening on it. Will look at several projects, and it will look at policies, programs, and plans to implement these projects. And that will probably happen at the beginning before there is procurement. And then for each of those single projects, there will be an environmental impact assessment that will follow the law. And at the same time, if those projects are financed by financial corporations, they will follow the needs or the requirements by those financial corporations. For example, if it's one of the projects is financed by the International Finance Corporation, it will have to meet the standard of the International Finance Corporation for Biodiversity, which is International Performance Standard 6. So one way of managing these impacts and one framework is the mitigation hierarchy. It's been on for decades. It's been widely used by companies all over the world, so it's nothing new. It's the sequence of actions to anticipate and avoid impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and avoid whether it's not possible, minimize when impacts occur, rehabilitate or restore where significant residual impacts remain. Where more significant impacts remain, offset those impacts. And just put simply for infrastructure, for example, for avoiding, you could redesign the infrastructure to avoid impacts on high biodiversity areas or water provision of natural systems, or could you incorporate these into corridor strategic documents when you do an ECA, so then it gets avoided in the environmental impact assessment stage, if you do it strategically. You could identify for minimization, you can identify best practice and impact mitigation measures. For example, wildlife crossings, water management plans, disaster risk management. There's loads of tools out there to minimize the impacts that are left after you are not able to avoid the impacts. Then you would use ecological restoration in the restore stage for restoring the areas that have been impacted during your projects. And then you will identify opportunities for offsets within the area of influence of development corridors. So that's a simple overview. And the key thing about the mitigation hierarchy is that it's key to achieve positive outcomes. And you have been hearing over these weeks, probably over these months, the net gain, no net loss, which has been going on for a while, but now the nature positive businesses. And this is what is most of it comes from in a way. So the mitigation hierarchy, you reduce impacts that in my figure in the purple or pink would happen, and through avoidance, minimization, restoration, you have significant residual impacts left, and you would do offsets to minimize those impacts. Avoidance and minimization have proven to be the most cost-effective ways of avoiding these impacts, but restoration and offsets, although complex and uncertain, they are fundamental to achieve positive outcomes and achieve net goal, no net loss or net gain, or even nature positive, because you are building things, so you must recreate things somewhere else. Just a little bit more, I think I'm going to run out of time very soon. The other aspects of the mitigation hierarchies, there are preventive measures and remediative measures. So for example, avoidance is a preventive measure. You should select the site properly. You should make a good design and scheduling of the project. So change the project, the way it's implemented or the way the operations are run to avoid impacts on migratory routes or breeding populations. So looking at before anything is done, how you can avoid impacts. And then the minimization, it's about physical controls, operational controls, and abatement controls. And if those still remain on significant impacts and they could be managed adequately, then you go for restoration and offsets. And very quickly, offsets is a big, huge topic, and I don't have time to expand on it, but there are very broadly two types of offsets: restoration offsets, which is when you restore the land that is degraded to achieve a gain, and averted offsets, which the classic one is to create a new protected area to avoid those losses that would have occurred if you hadn't created a protected area. And this is just a point. I'm not going to read all of this to say that these avoid, minimize, restore, and offset in gray below, you have to implement them through the life cycle of the project, to the timeline of the project. And here is a timeline developed by the Cross-Sector Biodiversity Initiative that is very interesting. There includes financing timeline, project timeline, and the mitigation timeline. So you have the link there to explore that further. And you would say, well, where do I start to do all of this? And I have just 3 easy ways to start before you start applying all of these mitigation measures. First, you have to define a good area of influence. I have shown in my image before. Then you have to identify all your area of importance within the area of influence. And that will also influence the redesign of the area of influence if it's needed. And then you gather data to build an appropriate biodiversity baseline, without which you cannot measure those different suite of impacts, and you cannot monitor if your measures have been successful. And as I said, there are many tools to do this, and through the different initiatives that are happening worldwide on sustainable infrastructure, I am sure you can start accessing those tools and talking to the experts. Finally, this is my last slide. There is moving from reactive to proactive mitigation is a big thing now. You see that many organizations are kind of advocating for the nature positive by 2030. The Convention of Biological Diversity is also going in that direction. And even the World Economic Forum, it's making the case, and companies are getting ready for this. And so it's a big thing now, and it's something that we have to aspire for. And the mitigation hierarchy, it's central to achieve this. So my conclusions are indirect and cumulative impacts can be much larger than direct impacts, and they must be accounted for. The mitigation hierarchy is a proven decision-making framework to design projects and manage impacts to pursue positive outcomes for nature. Avoidance and minimization, as I said, are proactive actions and very effective ways of reducing impacts, but they will not eliminate all impacts. And to achieve a net positive or nature positive or net gain or no net loss, whatever you want to call it, you need restorations and offsets, and that's a complex topic that could take a whole webinar, and we're happy to work on that with you. And finally, as I said, the world is moving from reactive mitigation to proactive. Instead of reacting to just mitigate the impacts, try to have approaches strategically and design for development and conservation together. And I think the next presentation is going to touch on that, because it's a development by design work by the Nature Conservancy, who have been pioneers in this kind of proactive approach to designing development, taking into account conservation as well. So that's all from me. Thank you very much, and I'm finished. Thank you. Here are the links to the website of our project, the Twitter, and my personal email and my Twitter account. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diego. That was great and very important, and of course very relevant with the IUCN folks meeting right now to think about how you build this mitigation, starting with avoidance and minimization, and eventually getting to offsetting if necessary as a last resort. Emily put a question in the link. We don't have time to go back and forth right now, but if people do have questions for Diego, go ahead and put them in the chat, and he might be able to answer a few that way. But also at the end of the formal presentation, after 75 minutes, we'll have an informal exchange. Diego will be there. Bruce, who you're going to meet in a moment, will be there. And we can answer Emily's very good question in the chat and any others. So thank you, Diego. Now, before we transition to the next, we have another Menti question. So please, everyone, go back to your Menti polling, and there are 2 questions there. We would like you to first ask, the mitigation hierarchy was developed for biodiversity, as we just heard, but it could also apply to other areas and projects. What have you used it for? Just put in one or one word, or put in a phrase as to other types of projects or sectors that you've worked, or issues that you've worked, something like the mitigation hierarchy. It doesn't have to specifically be that, but that type of approach. And then would like you to, for each of those 4 areas, to go ahead and indicate which one of those you focus mostly on: avoidance, minimization, or restoration. And we will see the results of that after our next speaker, who will give us a case presentation. Bruce McKenney has been working for 25 years at the intersection of development and environmental challenges, and he leads global strategies at the Nature Conservancy, where he works to reduce energy and infrastructure footprint and improve their sustainability. He also is working to accelerate the clean energy transition and expand the protection of lands and waters. Bruce is doing some really interesting work right now that fits very much into the topic we're doing, trying to look at, if we're going to expand renewable energy, solar and wind, how are we going to do that without using up critical conservation sensitive lands and biodiversity? But what we're going to hear about today is not that. You can talk to Bruce later about that topic in the question and answer session at the end. Today, we're going to hear about landscape scale planning to support conservation, nomadic livelihoods, and sustainable development in Mongolia. So, Bruce, off to you.
Thanks, Liz, and good to be with you all today for the webinar. Thanks for the opportunity to present. Before diving in, I want to acknowledge the many people that have been involved in leading and working on the landscape scale planning in Mongolia. It includes our main partner, the government of Mongolia, our TNC team and directors in Mongolia, Gala Dava and Engtuya Oidov, and lead scientist Joe Kiesecker and Mike Heiner, who put in a ton of time on this, as well as many, many partners. I first went to Mongolia in 2009 in my role directing our development by design program with Joe Kiesecker. And it's as Diego mentioned, it's a proactive program that uses landscape scale planning to advance sustainable development and conservation goals. And since my first trip to Mongolia, I've been hooked on the country. It's just got spectacular landscapes and wildlife and amazing people. And if you get a chance to go, you should visit. While I've been there probably a dozen times, it was my hope that the TNC Mongolia team could present to you today, but unfortunately with the timing and the time zones, we couldn't make it work. So you've got me today, and I'm gonna run through a case around the work we've been doing in Mongolia over the last decade, really. The story here is about proactive planning at a large scale that can support both sustainable development and conservation goals. It specifically ties to everything that Diego presented, I think, so well in his presentation around Principle 3. It's a way to address the potential cumulative impacts of multiple infrastructure projects on ecosystems and communities. And we need to have landscape scale planning to guide the application of the mitigation hierarchy. Otherwise, we might lock in a cycle of infrastructure development that has adverse impacts. Next slide, please, Claire. So when we arrived in Mongolia and started this project a little over a decade ago, there was a huge amount of the country under lease for potential mining. It's kind of everything you see in color there. The purple areas were active mines. So you can see there wasn't a huge amount of active mining, but there was the country was poised for rapid expansion of mining development. And for a country with natural landscapes largely intact, the scale of this development and the potential cumulative impacts of projects across the country and fragmenting different areas was a major sustainable development challenge. Next slide, please. And there were rising concerns over how mining development could affect Mongolia's natural heritage of lands and waters, the ways of life for nomadic people who had grazed animals on these lands for millennia, and the potential impacts to wildlife and habitat. And if you give it one more click, Claire, this was captured widely in the news in Mongolia when we were there. And this is because about 1/3 of the population depends on lands and waters for nomadic herding. And these are the same lands that are also important for Mongolia's amazing wildlife, like the hulan that you see at the bottom of the slide, the Mongolian gazelle, the saiga, many other species. And those species need large ranges, large areas to move and to survive. And mining and the roads and railways and everything that Diego was presenting on development corridors was going to have an impact on grazing lands, water sources, fragmenting wildlife habitat in ways that would shrink the available habitat areas. Next slide, please. So in 2010, we engaged the Mongolian government to propose undertaking a landscape scale planning process across the country. And the government agreed under an MOU to support this because they viewed this kind of upstream planning of the development cycle as something that would help them make decisions. If you give it one more click, if we kind of tie this to the infrastructure life cycle circle that Diego was presenting, it's an effort to do the right strategic planning right up front. We think this can guide better outcomes for development. And also Mongolia has a 30% protection goal that was set in 1992 for the country. And so how do you achieve the kinds of development that you want to see, as well as protect the most important places in your country? And this is a key point for landscape scale planning, I think. We're not just looking at conservation values in isolation. We're looking at those values in the context of where development is projected, where it might go, and other important considerations like nomadic herding and water sources. Next slide, please. So under an MOU with government, including the ministry overseeing mining and energy and the Ministry of Environment, so we were cutting across the important ministries of the government and getting their agreement and support. Over a course of 5 years, from 2011 to 2016, we completed a science-based and stakeholder-driven landscape scale planning process. It covered 4 different regions that make up the entire country. And that stakeholder process involved government and mining companies and communities and academics and many, many others. I think we totaled it up at 105 local partners that we worked with on this. And over the course of this, there were challenges. You know, managing a large stakeholder process, you need to be prepared to do that, and that's central to making this work. And you need to bring in all the different parties across sectors. The technical challenges, you know, very few countries have all the data they need. And so putting together a technical team that can use the best available data to do the plan in ways that can support decision-making is entirely doable. It's important, though, we found, to bring in local academics, community input, both for the robustness of the plan, but also for the buy-in and ownership of the plan. On the governance side, obviously support across the ministries. There also needs to be policy review. This is not just to develop a plan to have a plan. It's a plan that you want to have used. And that means that you've got to look at what are the enabling policies in the country for applying the mitigation hierarchy that Diego went through there. In other words, if the plan is showing certain places that should be avoided, what policies are going to actually make that happen? If the plan is going to suggest some restoration or offsets, what's going to make that happen? And in this case, in Mongolia, we worked with government to amend the environmental impact assessment law to create provisions for biodiversity offsets, which hadn't been in policy before. That was in 2012. And then lastly, on the financial side, obviously there were concerns about the plan and what it might do and affect on the mining economy. I think we'd argue that it actually is a way to reduce risks and has probably supported mining development. And the resources just to carry out the landscape scale plan were not clear. Is government going to pay for it? The financial institutions that Diego mentioned, like the IFC, EBRD, they have performance standards that rely on this kind of information. Should they pay for it? Should the companies pay for it? But there's only one company here, one company there. And so there is this issue of kind of everybody's benefiting from this plan, but how do you pay for it? We managed to get funding from all those sources, which I think testifies to the benefits of doing a landscape scale plan, but it can be a challenge. So now I just want to quickly go through very briefly in simplified way the landscape scale planning technical process. And of course, our science team could do this better than me, but I will give it a shot. So next slide, please. So what you're looking at here is the Gobi region of Mongolia, the southern region of the country. It's a place where a lot of mining happens. And the green areas that you see are existing protected areas, as well as the initial conservation portfolio, meaning these are the places that are most important for conservation values. They keep the landscape connected, they'll keep it functional, conditions good for wildlife, and so on. All the other colors, the yellow, the red, those are mining either leases or active mines. So this is just a first step, you know, where are the most important places and where is development going? Next slide, please. And then we look at conflicts. Well, where are the potential conflicts in the future between the proposed mining development and the areas that have high conservation value? And that's shown here in red. Next slide. And so this is where it gets interesting. You have these conflict areas. What are you going to do about them? And from a conservation perspective, some of these places where there are conflicts have such high biological value, meaning they may be rare habitat areas that exist nowhere else. They may be habitat that is essential for the survival of a species. Those are places we can't lose and still achieve our conservation goals. So those should stay in the portfolio, and they're in blue here. But there are places that maybe, while they have high value and you'd rather not see impacts, if development occurred there, there's potential to do restoration and offsets other places. And so the landscape scale plan provides a certain flexibility to meet the various interests around the table that are not just conservation interests, they're development interests. And then next slide, please. And so with that, you can redesign the portfolio and identify new places in the portfolio, which you see in kind of bright green there, and allow the other ones to potentially be developed and to do offsets other places. Next slide. So ultimately, that process was done in 4 different regions of Mongolia to create a national conservation blueprint that represents 30% of Mongolia. This was adopted into the National Master Plan for Protected Areas in 2016, and it's guiding the protected area development for Mongolia. Next slide, please. So just to kind of show you that this is a plan that's being used and is guiding protected areas in Mongolia, if you click one more time, you'll see the eastern region of the country where we first did the work. So the dark green is what's existing protected areas, and the light green is what was identified in the conservation portfolio as places with high conservation value, but also less likely to have conflicts with development. And now you can kind of click through to the whole country. And you'll see in blue are the new protected areas. These are national protected areas and local protected areas that have been designated over the last 5 years. You can go ahead and click through the rest of the country. To where Mongolia is now at 21% protection. And as these new protected areas are being designated, you know, they're not only achieving their conservation goal, but they're doing it in ways that are least conflict for development. Next slide, please. So I just want to close out with a few lessons from our process. First off, you know, landscape scale planning can help decision makers with this challenge of cumulative impacts that Diego described so well. We see in a lot of countries kind of waves of infrastructure development. It might be energy, mining, commercial agriculture, but there are areas where the natural resource base is strong for a particular type of development, and you're going to see multiple projects and infrastructure supporting those projects in that region. Yet the way we address that is through EIA primarily, which is a project by project piecemeal approach that doesn't address cumulative impacts very well at all. So you know, what we're pushing for here is that kind of upfront strategic planning that can guide the development and also can be an input to the EIA process. The second lesson is that this approach can inform the policies for how you apply the mitigation hierarchy. As I mentioned, it was important to put a policy in place for offsets here. There may be other policies to kind of strengthen avoidance as a first step and really the most important step. Another lesson, the third here around sustainable development, is that this is not just a conservation plan. This can be very good for development. The banks want sustainable investment portfolios. That is a collection of projects that are going to have low risk. And how do you lower the risk for projects? You identify proactively ways that you can develop that are not going to have negative impacts to communities and to the environment. So while it may be viewed as, well, are we tying up certain lands in conservation? Another way to look at that is that we are proactively doing risk mitigation that needs to be done regardless, and let's do it up front and avoid conflict. And then lastly, at its core, landscape scale planning is a stakeholder-driven process. I know I presented a lot of maps and a lot of technical stuff, but what it really comes down to is a stakeholder process. It needs strong government champions. It needs the good technical approach, but ultimately the plan should reflect the values and the goals of the stakeholders of the country. And so I'll stop there, and thanks for the opportunity to present today.
Thank you, Bruce. That was fantastic. Great to learn about that project and application, and just reiterating your point, it feels like so much of our work comes down to stakeholders and governance. So appreciate that point. Unfortunately, we don't have time for direct questions for Bruce, but really welcome questions and answers. Bruce and Diego, if you can respond to any questions or comments that come in through the chat, that would be great. And we can kind of keep that live. And then as Liz mentioned, at the end of our kind of formal session here at 75 minutes, we're going to stay afterwards and just have an informal conversation. So that's another time to be able to ask Diego and Bruce questions. So going back to the Menti results, or that questions that were asked after Diego's presentation. So the mitigation hierarchy was developed for biodiversity, but applies to other project aspects. What have you used it for? So some of the answers that we've gotten include restoration a number of times, transportation, both or linear infrastructure development came up many times. And then some people have never used it before and or have used other tools, eliminate, reduce, isolate, and control, which is a new one to me. So maybe others have used that approach. The second question was, which part of the mitigation hierarchy have you used most? So we were just kind of interested to see where Menti Meter is amazing. You can kind of see where the different inputs have come in, but it looks like most are familiar, or you have applied minimization. And really looking forward to exploring after this session how nature positive outcomes can be achieved through this. So with that, we're going to transition, kind of exit the formal part of our time together today and go into some breakout rooms. So we're going to have 15 minutes for breakout rooms, and you'll have a facilitator within our planning team, our host organizations, and there's two main questions that to prompt the conversation, and these will be pasted in the chat so you can reference them there. The first is, please share landscape scale planning examples you're familiar with. You know, Bruce shared the example from Mongolia, and really curious, did they work well, and why or why not? And then kind of thinking back on Diego's presentation and the mitigation hierarchy, what are examples of how the mitigation hierarchy has been used for different infrastructure types? So we saw some people have used it for restoration, linear transportation or linear infrastructure projects. So you know, what's working well there as well. So we can kind of have an exchange of experiences in the breakout room. And I want to do one plug before we do go into breakout rooms, which is, as a part of you all being here today, we have a survey that we'll send around kind of to get your feedback on this session and kind of the webinar series in total. And if after completing that post-session survey, you receive a certificate of completion. So I know that a lot of links have already been pasted in the chat, but keep your eye out for that one, because that one's important for us and kind of how we can continue to evolve and improve these sessions going forward. Okay, so breakout rooms are coming, and we have the questions, they'll be in the chat. And then the last thing, importantly, is while you're in the breakout sessions, the Menti Meter has these same questions there, and we'd love for you to record your thoughts and inputs within the Menti Meter, and then we'll review those together when we come back, so we can get a sense of what the different conversations were like in the different rooms. So any questions, or if that direction wasn't clear, please message me directly in the chat, and we'll do our best to sort it out. So we'll see you in the breakout rooms, and we'll be back here in about 15 minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. I have to imagine that your conversations were as animated as the one in our room. I always learn so much. It's amazing. So I'm gonna share my screen. And so as I mentioned in the Menti Meter, we had a space where folks could enter their response to the breakout prompts. So this first one on landscape planning, what's worked well, why or why not? I look forward to reviewing this in detail. One of the key things that came up for us was around change in governance. So you can have a fantastic landscape plan and have all the stakeholders and government committed, and then the government changes, which is really a challenge. And so how can we address that? And kind of capacity building came up, really engaging different ministries, particularly the Ministry of Finance, in the development of these landscape plans, so that they can be more likely to have continuity if many ministries have adopted them, and kind of making that finance connection of the benefits of what will result within a landscape plan to demonstrate and kind of incentivize the investment to different regions. On the mitigation hierarchy, I'm looking, yeah, so it's been used for highway infrastructure, hydrocarbon pipeline development, bridges, motorways. Yeah, and just kind of making that connection between the mitigation hierarchy being applied within environmental impact assessments. And in our group, there was kind of a case was shared that overall it's working pretty well, especially when companies want to do the work, they want to achieve sustainable development outcomes, then there's a motivation to do well and work through this project. But I kind of wonder what percentage of kind of companies or projects have that motivation to achieve sustainable development outcomes. If you don't, that might decrease the likelihood of the kind of effective use of the approach. All right, so it's now kind of our close here, and just a thank you again to our speakers and everyone who's here today. Please complete the post-session survey to receive the certificate of attendance. Liz mentioned the LinkedIn group that was just formed for this community, so connect with us there. And one of our partners, the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, has a webinar that's happening tomorrow, and we'll put that link into the chat. And please stay with us for the post-session informal question and answer. And I get to do a pitch for the next session, which will be on October 13th. And this is on the next principle, principle 4, avoiding environmental impacts and investing in nature. I'm particularly passionate about this one. And one of the reasons, I'm not expecting you to read this, but the highlight here is that nature-based solutions should be prioritized. And so that's what next month we'll be kind of digging into, and kind of how do you do that. And one of the tools we're going to highlight is the International Union for Conservation Networks Global Standards for Nature-Based Solutions. That's the tool that we'll be talking about. So with that, thank you all so very much again for joining. Always a pleasure, and please stay with us to kind of ask your questions directly to our speakers, or follow up, make any connections.
Sir, madam, what code I have to enter in the Menti Meter?
Let's see if we can paste in the chat. There should be a link. Let me see if I can pull it up to the post survey. Let's see if I can open it up and share it here.
2D.
It will look something like this. Hopefully you guys can see my screen still.
Sorry, I think I just posted the wrong Menti link in the chat. So
this 02.
why don't we will work on this and make sure we get the right Menti link in there for you all to fill out your post-course survey. Oh, there it is.
Sarah's got it.
This should be the link right here for the post-session survey, and the Menti link from the, if you want to put in from your breakout sessions, do you want to repost that one too, please, Sarah? Meanwhile, why don't you take the screen down and we will start our, and if you're still having a problem, put it in the chat and we will chat with you there. So I have a question for Bruce. I just wanted to start off and then I'm going to open it up to anyone. But I just was curious with the landscape scale planning, how does that help with the more traditional EIAs, the environmental impact assessment, which are still required in really all projects with any significant environmental impacts? How do those two relate to each other?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think at the front end, what the landscape scale plan can do is give you the big picture. So you get from that at a landscape level, it could be a watershed, the information around where higher conservation values are, where there may be particularly important areas for protection, what is supporting the functionality of the ecosystem that, you know, should it be disconnected or fragmented would have a significant impact. And so I think it supports the avoidance at the front end in terms of ideally where projects are looking to site and develop in the first place. So often what we see are projects that are at some investment stage before they even start looking at that issue. And then it becomes all about minimization, which may not be possible. And so it's really addressing those upfront risks first. And then, you know, importantly, most EIAs ask for consideration of cumulative impacts, but that it's not necessarily well done, and it's hard, frankly, for one particular project to do that. We don't always have good sharing around information on different EIAs, and there may not be knowledge of all the potential development in a region to actually determine potential cumulative impacts. So it gives you that picture of some of the projected development, at least in the way that we do it with development by design. It's not going to capture everything, but I think those plans, what we try to do is think about the major land use drivers of major land use change. So what are is it energy development and agriculture? Is it urbanization? And those patterns of development tend to be non-random. You kind of know where some of this is going to go over time if you know the resource base and you know the patterns of development in the region. So the science has gotten a lot stronger on that. We should be harnessing that and providing that as a base of information that all the EIAs can use. And ideally that would lower the cost for all the companies and investors that are looking to develop in that region.
Thanks. Thank you, Bruce. If anybody wants to insert themselves, make a comment, or ask a question, feel free to just speak right now, or you could also put your raise hand function and I will call on you. So I'm going to pause a moment and see if anybody, I don't want to be the only one asking questions here. So Emily, I think you had a question for Diego earlier. Do you want to repeat that question? You are on mute.
yeah, my question is about nature positive outcomes, and like if the mitigation hierarchy is the best tool to lead to nature positive outcomes. You know, because I think well, in my experience, a lot of the focus has been on minimize and avoid, which is not necessarily improving the baseline condition when you first come to a project site, or so it seems like, from my experience, that the mitigation hierarchy approach is almost like a do no harm, not a do better. And so I just would love to hear any reactions to that, if others have had similar experiences, and what we could do better to like lead to those nature positive outcomes. So
I totally agree with you, Emily. In fact, I responded to your question in the chat. When I talk about reactive and proactive, I mean that, yeah, traditionally the approach to impact assessment has always been, let's do this, let's see what the negative impacts are, and let's try to fix them. But right now, in the past years, especially now ahead to the COP and in the World Congress, the nature positive approach and the proactive approach is to try to do good rather than just do the minimum. And one good example, well, you probably are aware of the nature positive statement because WWF, I think, was part of that statement. But you know, there is a mitigation and conservation hierarchy, which is an approach that has been developed by different experts. It includes TNC. Joe was there, I was there as well, but also private sector people and funders. And it tries to go beyond just being reactive. And then there's the Science-Based Target Network, which is this massive project that they're trying to develop targets for businesses. They're also looking into the proactive way of achieving these things. So I think people are acknowledging that it's not just about minimizing the harm, but trying to see at a broader scale, like the development by design does, is how can we do good and how we keep plan for it. So yes, it's coming. There are examples.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that the recent assessments, I think it was from the last 25 years using spatial analysis, the amount of natural lands we are losing are something like 17 football or soccer, whatever you're into, fields per minute. And so we're still losing a lot, and it's actually accelerating. And so to get to nature positive, you know, it's kind of an all hands on deck. I think we have to avoid a lot more. When we look at it from a compensation standpoint, we estimated in a recent Financing Nature report that maybe about 5% gets compensated, but most of the biodiversity impacts out there are just happening. And so we can talk about needing to protect and avoid more, and we absolutely need to, but I think we have to do better across the whole hierarchy.
Lazaro, I see that you have your hand up.
Yes, Sarah, thank you very much. I like very much the discussion because I'm coming from the ecology and transportation, let's say, background. And when we talk about that, Diego's presentation was really fantastic. But when we talk about that, especially in Europe, when we would like to avoid a linear infrastructure alignment, for example, for a protected area, for Natura 2000, then it's avoidance. It's not only the only one solution. You have to go immediately to mitigation, because then you have to change the alignment. But in this case, we have to be careful and to support the ecological corridors and ecological cohesion of protected areas. So it's not such a simple situation. It's not say, okay, we say avoid and that's all. After the avoiding, you have to start immediately to talk about mitigation, minimization, compensation, and so on. So you have to see the balance and how to, it depends on the protective objective. And as priority is the protected areas, as a second level, you have to go to the cohesion of the protected areas. And we saw this fantastic map from Mongolia. This is really nice. We can easily say, okay, let's avoid to make a linear infrastructure, a railway there, outside of the green protected areas. But immediately we have to start to talk about mitigation measures there, especially in the steppe ecosystem, which means have a special environmental and ecological demands to support the ecological connectivity. Thank you.
Anna, on that note, it sounds like the session that you all are doing today, Transport for
Nature initiative,
really links quite well with what we just heard about from Lazaros, no?
yeah. So there will be this initiative that will be launched tonight. Tonight in France, and I think it would be the best time for you to follow it online. So I think Sarah already copy and paste the link, so you can register and follow the conference that would be held tonight at 6:30, and that would be also at 6:30. At 6:30. Yes. I thought it was at 6. And there will be another session tomorrow morning in France, so you might be all asleep. But so this initiative is launched within the Infrastructure and Nature Coalition. That's why also we copy paste the link of Infrastructure and Nature Coalition. They organize many events regarding sustainable infrastructure all over the week within the IUCN Congress. So if you want to know more about them and about this initiative, just register and follow the link.
Great. So I have one last question, and then I think we're going to have to wrap it up, but thanks to everyone for staying on. And this, Bruce, is back to you again. When we talk about cumulative impacts, we've talked about single sectors mostly and their various impacts. But as I mentioned earlier in your introduction, one of the really important, interesting intersections or cumulative impacts we're going to see is as we look to transition to clean energy, there will be impacts throughout society. And one of them will be on biodiversity and lands and land use if we are able to install as many solar power and wind farms as all the models are telling us we're going to need. And so how does this landscape planning, how could that help address that sort of issue?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I mean, I think it's even more important for the renewable energy build out. To give people a sense of this, we need 10 times what we have now just for Paris. We need much more than that for net zero in terms of wind and solar. Wind and solar take a lot of land for development. The concern is that when you have build outs that require a lot of land, you have land use conflicts, environmental, social, community, and so on. And then that slows down all your progress to the climate goal. And you know, in the US, they estimate to get to net zero, you need a land area the size of Colorado and Wyoming combined. So for those of you that know the US, those are pretty big states. What we see with land use planning where it can help is that wind and solar in many countries are abundant resources across large areas. And that gives you more flexibility for the planning of that build out to do it in ways that have less impact. And so we believe, and we've done the science to look at the amount of converted lands around the world and the renewable energy resources and the availability of it, that you can meet the climate goals many times over with renewable energy on lands that are already low value from a conservation standpoint. And so it's more a question of how do we do both? There doesn't need to be a lot of trade-offs there between the development of renewable energy and our biodiversity goals. It's a subject that journalists love because it kind of makes environmentalists go against each other. But it's really one that we can have our cake and eat it too. And we just need to be smart right now.
Great. Well, thank you all. Look forward to seeing you next month and online in our LinkedIn group. And thanks for joining us.